UK. So our telecoms sector was commercialised, or privatised rather, fairly early. And so you could go to places in the UK, quite a few places, and not get good mobile coverage. And that's because it never was economically viable for those private telcos to basically put the infrastructure there. So we're having to address that now. And I think, you know, Nepal is in a similar situation with your topography, where it'll be very expensive to reach those very vulnerable and remote communities, to deliver roads, to deliver adequate schooling, healthcare, etc. And we spend a lot of our money supporting those types of infrastructure, social and community infrastructure, and we will continue to do that going forward, and working with the local governments to help them plan it adequately.
Wonderful. So I hope you got that. So one is addressing, you know, market failure issues, but the second is bringing these new skill sets, you know, and global practices or knowledge from around the world to bear on these problems. But the third is the last mile, you know, making sure nobody is left behind. And so those are very clear, you know, role that the development partners can play, you know, in this process. So we'll come back to you, Dr. Evans. So you've been listening, you know, quietly, but the word climate and vulnerabilities, crisis, you know, we've heard it a lot this morning. But also from, you know, the keynote speakers and the panelists, we're also hearing that there are opportunities. And so people are actually looking at these as not just challenges, but opportunities. But in moving ahead, and so this is sometimes an analogy we have to use, is, you know, when you drive, the windscreen is much bigger than the rear view mirrors. And I'm sure there's a reason for that. And it's to force you to look ahead and not look behind. So, you know, we say vulnerable, we are in crisis, but surely these are opportunities, you know, moving ahead. But in moving ahead, you know, what do we, you know, keep in mind? What do we watch out for? You know, where are the early warning, you know, systems that we need to be mindful of? Dr. Evans?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to talk about risks and opportunities. And I think that the Vice President Lavasa mentioned the increased ambition for climate finance from ADB. We do intend to become the region's climate bank. We've been known as the region's infrastructure bank. There's a reason we're making that shift, and that is because the vulnerabilities to climate risks for infrastructure are so huge across the region, but the opportunities are also huge. So the recent floods in Pakistan, the Gloff-like landslides that have damaged the Melamchi water supply intake, those are disasters that are going to increase in frequency and intensity in the years to come. So if you're thinking about infrastructure development and you're not building in a recognition of climate risks, then you're probably not building sustainable infrastructure. And so our view is that we need to bring these together so that we are supporting the development of sustainable infrastructure, sustainable and also resilient, helping resilience for local communities the infrastructure is supposed to support. So that's a very clear future direction for ADB. We think it's essential. The need for finance to address these new risks, relatively new risks, is significant. And so we're looking at new ways to mobilize finance, and this is where we see opportunities. So for example, recently in the Philippines, we approved our first climate change policy-based loan. This is a loan that supports the government to make policy reforms, regulatory reforms, and build the institutional capacity necessary to bring in the private sector, to enable the private sector, empower the private sector to engage in the opportunities for low-carbon, climate-resilient infrastructure in the Philippines. We think this is going to be a demand from many, many countries across the region, and we think it's essential to enable that sustainability in terms of the investment. We also recognize there's a need to mobilize new financial resources for the public sector, not just the private sector. So we're currently working on a rather what we call the Innovative Finance Facility for Climate for Asia and Pacific. And the idea in a nutshell is to establish a guarantee facility it's a pilot of about $2.5 billion. That'll actually release about $9 billion to $10 billion of climate finance headroom for ADB, which we can then lend on to our developing member countries. And that will generate somewhere around $40 to $50 billion in climate resilient, low carbon infrastructure. So the leverage effect is phenomenal. I also want to, I'm going to, I don't have these memorized, so I'm going to look at this, but I want to mention a few new initiatives that really are related to trying to help countries to recover from COVID in the region and to address climate risks and opportunities. VP Lavasa mentioned the Cambodia Solar Park project. This is an ADB $7.64 million loan to support the construction of a 100-megawatt solar power park in Cambodia. In addition to the loan, the financing package included $11 million of concessional loan and $3 million of grant from the Strategic Climate Fund, so a blended finance investment. It was structured as a PPP, and it drew 26 bidders, including several global companies, and has achieved the lowest power purchase tariff for a solar project so far in Asia. So this is very, very significant. Another example are the new Thailand sustainability bonds. A small technical assistance grant from ADB of $200,000 was used to mobilize almost $5.6 billion in several tranches and is being used to finance low carbon transport infrastructure. So if you're looking at e-mobility for Kathmandu Valley, here's one way to maybe mobilize the resources. Another one is called the SDG Indonesia One Green Finance Facility. It is an infrastructure investment platform. It has 4 pillars focused on commercial financing, concessional fund for de-risking, an equity fund, and project development. And it's mobilized already about 3 to 6 times private sector funding from the initial $150 million loan from ADB. So I think I'll stop with those examples, but there are many, and these are all within the last 2 to 3 years. So the scene is changing, the risks are increasing, and I think we all have to adapt to that situation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think the examples highlight the fact that it can be done. Right? I mean, the fact that it's happening is very important. So maybe this is a good time to go to Dr. Wagle and Mr. Ashok. So basically we've heard just across this panel, we've heard the private sector, we've heard the investment people, we've heard the climate risk, and then also what the development partners can enable in this process. So Dr. Wagle, if you're going to leave this hall, go back to what you do, would you be happy with the sense of we know what we need to do. The summit is an amazing place where we can bring people together, and then together we can maybe address some of those challenges that you mentioned. So in terms of moving ahead, can we capture some key issues that we will share with the audience in terms of what you mentioned in your keynote speech, but then based on what you've already heard now from the panel. Any thoughts?
I think so. I'm encouraged by the optimism displayed by the panelists in terms of the opportunities that exist, all the new issues. I focused a little bit on digitalization, but development finance now is climate finance. It's morphing into that. There are opportunities there while we manage the risks. Financing is not an issue, Radhesh ji was saying, but I think the subtext of remarks from all the speakers is not so much market failures, but it's governance failures. That's the main message that I took away. And we could have had this exact conversation in 2014 at the first infrastructure summit. In fact, we probably did, if you go back and rewind the videotapes. So that's, I think, that the shift, and this is where I would like to sort of call on the young folks of this country, the media of this country, to now come out swinging, and the elections are just around the corner. We're just sick and tired of inaction. We're talking about the political economy of inaction at one of our dialogues yesterday. And this is where the whole political economy, the barriers have to be broken down, right? So we know what the issues are. We sort of know what ought to be done. And we know what others have done. And this is really a governance story at the end of the day. And time has come for us to really exert that decisive pressure on the political. And we've experimented with that a little bit in some of the mayoral elections, for example. But it's not easy. I mean, I'm not naive. A lot of the interests are entrenched. Political parties in our country behave more like patronage networks. But with the demographic push, the power of information, a narrative of compelling change that is happening all around us, and I think the elections are the time where we make that breakthrough. Just a final thought, I tell my folks, I mean, audiences, different audiences in the villages, in the towns, and in Kathmandu, that relative to where Nepal was 30 years ago, we've made fantastic progress. So if you compare Nepal of 2022 with Nepal of 1990, there's so much to celebrate. But if you compare Nepal of today with countries that were exactly like us in 1990, we've fallen way behind. And that's, the governance is what has held us back, right? So I'm not even talking about the rapidly growing East Asian countries, even the Vietnams and the Cambodias and Bangladesh, now the new superstar in our region. Just, in our high school, we used to talk about Bangladesh in very disparaging terms. But it's a success story now. And the only thing that has held us back are those governance failures.
Very good. And so you know that when you exchange the US dollar in Dhaka, and then for a Nepali, you certainly know how Bangladesh is doing really well. So, Mr. Ashok, so on this point, so you've heard, you mentioned, the issues of complacency, you mentioned the issue of vulnerability, and then also of, the modalities with which we can ahead. But I think, the conclusion here is, governance is essential, it's key. There are risks, there are opportunities, the private sector is ready, the money is there. So in terms of, moving ahead, where do you see that missing piece, that we all need to put our energy on?
Magic. Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think one of the points that has been made is that there is no dearth of financial resources. What we must recognize is that money has a certain magnetic quality. But the magnet by itself doesn't mean anything. You need forces to attract that magnet. So what is it that will attract money? I think that is a question which we keep asking. And the sense that I get whenever we have a seminar of this kind is that perhaps it is not that we are not growing or we are not progressing. We are restless, we are not happy with the pace of growth. And I think everybody wants to increase the pace of growth. The issue is quite elementary. I think the world over, people want to progress, they want their life to be better, they want to develop. And besides their own enterprise and effort, what they are looking for is an environment around them, the circumstances which are congenial for deploying their enterprise. And that is where, to my mind, I think government has a primary responsibility. It has a social contract with people, and that social contract is essentially based on trust that government is the custodian of public interest. Now, to my mind, the government can play two major roles. One, it has to create an environment where private sector enterprise, private sector resources are deployed. They feel confident that even without an active support of government, they can do business and create prosperity around them. The second is those sectors where the government has played a very important role in the past. It will continue to play a role in the future, both because of the way either government has been in business or because there is a huge consumer interest to be protected. So sectors like electricity, gas supply, and there are so many, aviation, there are so many sectors where a consumer interest is involved, and government would like to make sure that the market forces are even and that the consumer interest is protected. That is where I think the public procurement, public-private partnership method of procurement becomes important. It is not a panacea. And what the thought that I would like to emphasize is that public-private partnership has three important elements. One is the public, the other, and in public, it is not only the government, it is the people at large. And it is the private sector, but it's a partnership. So it is a relationship, commercially oriented relationship. It is not a relationship where the government is the provider of incentive or provider of opportunity and then it withdraws. It is a continuous relationship in which you have to share the risk and have a predictable environment in which the investor knows who will bear a risk when the situation arises.
Sure.
Thank you.
Very good. So what I'm going to do is the four panelists. So we've heard, very clearly that, for example, in Nepal, November 20th, the winds of change hopefully will, take care of many things. And so democracy, elections are one way that the country progresses, right? But the term that you used, the political economy of inaction, sounds like the title of a book that might be coming up soon. But in the same way, so let's start with Heidi at that end. Surely a summit like this, when people come together and we put our heads together, surely we can do something, to tip the scale. And so, yes, we've done a lot. We can say, we can congratulate ourselves, but then there are frustrations. But then the fact that everybody's come together, in this summit means that maybe there's a momentum that we can, give. So give me your thoughts on how, this group might want to move ahead.
I think these summits are really useful and crucial actually for moving ideas and solutions forward. I started my career in a think tank, and so I did a lot of work writing policy papers on how we could do things differently, particularly in international development and from an economics perspective. And I think really you just need one of those ideas to percolate and switch a light in someone's mind who then has an influential role, be it in the government, be it in the private sector, be it in the international community, to start doing things differently. So I thank the organisers for bringing us all together, and I'm glad that we've been able to support today.
Very good. Rajesh?
Thank you, Anil. No, the way I look at it is, so far I think in Nepal, things are happening at the central level. I mean, we make decisions in Kathmandu, and I don't know to what extent it gets spread to other municipalities or districts. I think we need to change that now. The way I look at it is, because of this changes federalism, I see the municipalities actually a very good place to make things happen. And what people need is, they need to see. They've heard a lot, for the last 40 years, we've been talking about changes, we've been talking about hydropower, we've been talking about Mount Everest, and all that tourism, and nothing really has happened. But what people would like to do is, even in a small way, they'd like to see changes that asset makes, infrastructure asset is making in their lives. Mm-hmm. So maybe shifting our focus from top down to bottom up, making changes at the municipality level, and then maybe, because right now I think the provincial level is really, I mean, they just don't have expertise. There's there are investment authorities established, but we need to look at that, how can that actually help? Because municipalities have a lot of projects, but the larger projects would be in 2 municipalities. So maybe start really helping the municipalities, seeing changes, and then coming up provinces, and then, federal can do whatever it's been doing. And I think once the people see changes happening, governance will automatically, come to place. I mean, I don't think people will be looking at transparency. People will be looking at, how government is acting, how the politicians are acting, the politics also will start becoming good. So rather than top bottom, I think the way to go forward is bottom up, and that's what our leaders need
Very
to
good.
focus on.
So Heidi said something very important. So at the end of this summit, if we can have one good idea that percolates across the system, across society, we can get there. But it's got to be, one of those powerful ideas that we all can. So this whole issue of turning the process on its head, so using federalism as an opportunity whereby we start building up governance, from the bottom and not wait for the center to bring those changes. So let's go on this side. So Nirvan, so in terms of, the group, the energy that we have, the fact that we are, brought together by a summit, so where would you like the energy to be focused on?
So I mean, it's very clear, right? I think former President Clinton also, one of the campaigns that made him the president, his theme was, "Is the economy stupid?" I think for us also, it's high time we got to put economy in the center stage of whatever we're going to be doing. And when I say economy, means infrastructure obviously plays a very, very critical pass into it. So I think we need to, there's creation of investment board, etc. But I think they need to be given probably much more freedom to be able to really make that into a one-window system for addressing the problems of all the investors. I see a lot of opportunity over there, but essentially I think it all boils down to the mindset of the policymakers or the decision makers wanting to be the biggest lifeline to the growth or the biggest bottleneck. So it all comes down to the mindset of creating the economy as the center stage of whatever we're going to be doing.
Very good. Okay, so Dr. Evans, so look at the group, look at the hall. I think there's a huge presence, some energy that we need to, bring together.
Well, I want to, you stole my bottom-up argument, so I want to build on that a little bit. I actually, and I'm not going to reflect on Nepal politics or anything else, but there are examples elsewhere where bottom-up approaches weren't working through government, and where the private sector really got engaged in at the community level, the village level, the town level, making good business sense out of helping communities develop their infrastructure, build the capacity to engage in whatever the private sector entity happened to be interested in, be whatever their business was, and actually get a much more equitable growth from the bottom up. And I think that's probably a good opportunity here. And there are, I'm happy to share some of the examples that we have from other countries where that's been done. Thank you.
No, very good. So I think, it's a good time to, sort of bring this all together. So the summit brings people together. And obviously the messages are not just about resources, but about modalities. It is about governance, which is a critical, sort of pivotal role, that we have. But the question is also, how we need to step back and look at infrastructure in this sort of broader, perspective. And so Dr. Wagle initially mentioned, we need to look at impact, we need to look at, governance, but also the broader definition of infrastructure. And so those become really critical. And Mr. Ashok, mentioning, both in terms of complacency, but also vulnerability, and then the modalities, with which we can move ahead. So I think it's been a really good, session to put, the big picture in front of the audience. And so the big picture is positive if we can get, the governance, so that critical piece into place. Now we have a very wise man who has been listening to all this, happening, our chairperson, Dr. Khatiwala. And so, the beauty of moderating from up here, the organizers actually have a stopwatch for us, on the screen. And so, just to prove that I'm a good moderator, so I'm giving you the last 10 minutes, for your thoughts. Please, please.
First of all, let me thank CNI for having invited me to this very encouraging seminar or workshop, whatever we say. My colleague Swarnim, Vice President of ADB, panelists, officials of CNI, and colleagues. At a time when the business environment is said to be very gloomy, at a time when we see a lot of not so encouraging news throughout the world because of revision of the world economy, the growth rates time and again by the bank and also by ADB, I suppose. And also when we can see continuation of the pandemic and also some of the reflections of climate risk in several countries. But despite all these things, I believe that you business colleagues always find a space to make investment because you know how to make space within the given constraints. And I'm very confident that you would definitely find spaces even within these constraints to invest in infrastructure. That's where this seminar makes a lot of sense. I think we had a series of such workshops, seminars, conventions before. I myself had participated in some of them. So the question is not of why at the moment. The question is where to invest and how to invest and how to build in complementarity within the infrastructure projects we are investing in. I start from the third issue, that is how to ensure complementarity. We do have a history of the past in infrastructure financing. Initially we said we don't have power and electricity, so we don't have industrial infrastructure to invest. Okay. Then once we have electricity, we have almost sufficient power now. And what we say now is we don't have the industrial infrastructure. Okay, once we have it, then we might say there is not much transport infrastructure across the border. Then even then, if we have the transport infrastructure, then we can say there is not much of the customs and trade facilitation infrastructure. So how long can we wait on sequencing all these infrastructures? We should properly plan in such a way that they are complementary to each other, and at the same time, once you overcome one of the constraints in one of the infrastructures, you would also be able to overcome several other constraints in other infrastructures. This is first question. The second question is balancing between infrastructure projects. What is that balancing? I mean tradable versus non-tradable infrastructure sectors. We have seen from our neighboring countries why even having made good investment and good internal infrastructure, creating a lot of domestic income and money, why they were not able to exchange that money into foreign exchange, why didn't have foreign exchange enough to pay for the debt or for the investors who wanted to repatriate their money back. The question is, we borrow in foreign currency, we invest in the area where we don't earn foreign currency despite that the projects are good, despite that the projects are earning local income, but given the foreign exchange gap, we'll fall in a trap like some of our neighboring countries are falling. So the balance, I say, is to have between the tradables and non-tradables. So having said that, I would emphasize on of the infrastructure projects where you can also earn foreign currency by exporting the services. What could be that? Tourism infrastructure, of course, growing potential for a hydro infrastructure. Second, some of the transport infrastructures like in aviation and others. There could be several other infrastructure projects where you can earn foreign currency and at the same time can serve either the debt you have borrowed or the kind of repatriation you have to make for the foreign investors. That is critical. Some of the issues that I confront as a practitioner of development planning and macroeconomics, couple of things we have to keep in mind. We know the climate risk is increasing. We know the continuation of the risk associated with pandemic, and we also have the risk and also some of the episodes of war already. Now, there is also a growing area of insurance, making many of those risks insurable. So insurance industry could also widen its scope in terms of covering risks which could be commercially insured. Take, for example, COVID. We didn't have any health insurance against COVID. We tried it. So, over time, there have been market-based risk management systems that we should also follow. Take, for example, the insurance of weather insurance. Take, for example, due to adverse weather condition, sometimes we do have bad rainfalls or not enough rainfalls. We have landslides, floods, whatever. But we have started insuring some of those things. So, weather-based indexation of the risk and then insuring the risk. Those kind of market-based instruments and infrastructure financing can also be further evolved in order to see that those risks which could be insured in a market mechanism has to really widen its coverage. That's important. Second, in terms of partnership and financing, what I see over time as my experience is, let's be credible, let's be honest in partnership. Otherwise, if we simply want to transfer the risk to the other partner, it doesn't work. It has happened, and it happened several times in a system where our regulations are not prudent, where we are not being put in a very equal footing, or we don't have equal information of the market and the business. There is always a risk that we try to pass on the risk to the other partner. It's equity partner or the loan financing institution. So, PPP, such a good model, we all encourage it, but over time, why PPP doesn't work most of the time in our case is that our credible partnership is always in question. Some of the failed projects in PPP in Nepal very much illustrate those kind of things, that we try to pass on risk to others. One more example of trying to pass on the risk is of hedging. As investor, we try to get the maximum return on our business. That's fine, because that's what is meant for. There is always a foreign exchange risk in a country like ours in terms of exchange rate movement. And we don't have a proper law governing hedging mechanism in the country. We have a regulation which is being revised now. That hedging mechanism must be very transparent, credible, and sustainable. Let's not try simply to put the burden of all investment to the foreign investors, or let's also not try to pass on all the risk to the host country through different mechanisms. So let's be honest in hedging mechanism also. In bank financing or other kind of financing, even in blended financing, I'll just pick up a couple of things. In bank financing, well, first, is there enough money to finance? Is finance not a problem at all? It's not a big problem for small ventures, but when it comes to big investment, it is a problem. We have to invest 20,000 billion rupees every year. In this very hall, maybe 3 years before, and we did try to do some formulations of the necessary laws. We did Industrial Enterprise Act, we did Foreign Investment and Technology Transfer Act, we did PPP Act, but a couple of other things are remaining. We need to revise the Company Act, we need to revise the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, we need to revise the Intellectual Property Act, and we need to properly revise the Hedging Act, and several other things, including money to be raised from capital market, and that includes private equity and others. So that's the regulatory and legal part. The other issue is making the so-called single window fully operational, which we can avoid for moving from offices to offices to get one project approved in a short while. So let's do that, and let's expedite to see that the single windows are in operation in full extent. Third is industrial infrastructure and also ongoing transport infrastructure. Let's complete them. And let's not hold the infrastructure project licenses for decades. If you hold licenses for decades, how can we develop country, make Nepal as a middle income country in the next 15 years' time or 10 years' time? So with this, let me thank once again the host, CNI, and let me also thank all the panelists and keynote speakers for having given very good deliberations. I think we had many things to pick up from the wise deliberations. With this, I conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. So over to Sadisha.
What an amazing first session here at the very first day of Nepal Infrastructure Summit 2022. We also definitely hope that not just one, but many ideas come in this two-day summit, and actions will carry forward those ideas and will change it into reality as well. Thank you very much to our amazing moderator, our brilliant panelists, our incredible keynotes, and our chair for those insights on this topic of the big picture on the post-COVID scenario. I would now like to request the president of CNI, Mr. Vishnu Kumar Agrawal, to kindly join us on stage to present the token of appreciation to our fabulous panelists, to our chairs, to our moderator, and to our keynotes as well. We'd like to thank our chair of this session, Dr. Yuvraj Khatiwada. Thank you very much, sir, for being a part of this event and this first summit here at Nepal Infrastructure Summit 2022. We'd also like to thank our keynote speaker, Dr. Swarnim Wagle. We'd also like to thank our keynote speaker, Mr. Ashok Lavasa. Our fantastic panelist, Mr. Radesh Pant. Ms. Heidi Tavakoli. Mr. Nirvan Chaudhary. Dr. Warren Evans. And a big thank you to our moderator as well. Thank you very much to Mr. Chitrakar for trying really hard to wrap up this amazing session within the given slot. We are running slightly, maybe 5 or 10 minutes late, but thank you. Can we have a big, big round of applause for this amazing first business session at Nepal Infrastructure Summit? And we'd like to request all our panelists for one group photo so that we can commemorate this moment as well. So, a group photo ko lagi अनुरोध गर्न चाहन्छु. यो first business session सकिएको छ भर्खरै Nepal Infrastructure Summit 2022 मा. Sir. Vishnu sir लाई पनि with this amazing first session, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to take a 15 minutes tea break. So yaharu sabaijanalai early morning हामीले कार्यक्रममा बोलाएका छौं. So तपाईको चिया कफी आज दिनको सुरुवात भएको छैन भने चिया कफी लिएर हल भित्रै आउनको लागि पनि म अनुरोध गर्न चाहन्छु. We'd like to start the session in the next 15 minutes. So a humble request to all our participants to kindly join us back in this hall in the next 15 minutes. Thank you very much.